At 8 o'clock in the morning on July 21st, 1899, Grace Hall and Clarence Edmonds Hemingway gave birth to a baby boy whom they named Ernest, the second born out of what was soon to be 6 children. The childhood home of young Hemingway is located in Oak Park, Illinois, and was built by his grandfather, Ernest Hall Hemingway. It is at this beautiful house that Hemingway learned his love for culture from his mother and partook in outdoor activities with his father. Grace Hall, a trained opera singer and well-esteemed music teacher, was the primary source for Ernest's love of the arts. From day to day, his mother made sure he attended his music lessons, primarily with the cello, which he never really excelled in. Though that may be true, the knowledge of the musical world had been greatly expanded for Ernest during these early years. When he was able to escape from the dreaded music lessons, he learned to be an outdoorsman, going along with his father on fishing trips and hunting in the forest at their summer home on Lake Walloon in Michigan. Clarence Hemingway may have been a doctor, but he nonetheless had a love for nature and made sure to pass down his love and respect of the natural world to his son. It had a great effect on the young boy, as from there on out the stories which Hemingway would compose always touched upon a natural theme. Knowing the happenings in the rest of Hemingway's life, it is quite a relief to be able to look back and see that at 439 North Oak Park, Illinois, the Hemingway family lived a rather peaceful and normal life, one free of any traumatic instances and full of happy, laughing, and widely intelligent young children. Back then, they had been unaware that their address would later become a historical literary landmark, calling tourists to come flooding through their front doors to take snapshots and catch glimpses of the early life their son had lived, long before he grew to refer to his hometown as being one with wide lawns and narrow minds. When the time for high school came around, Ernest attended the local school, Oak Park High, where he spent 4 years as well as anyone possibly could. His character as the brash, clever, and outgoing Hemingway having been built up over his high school career. As would become habit, Hemingway was adventurous and in need of constant action. In order to keep himself busy, Ernest involved himself in a number of different sports, namely water polo, track and field, and especially boxing, all of which his expertise left much to be desired. When it came to his classes, he excelled, particularly in English, and due to his musical knowledge and forced lessons by his mother, Hemingway even decided to play side by side with his sister Marceline Hemingway in the school orchestra. It wasn't until his junior year, however, that Hemingway would ultimately begin his writing career. Joining the high school newspaper staff, the Trapeze, and the school yearbook, the Tabula, a very young Hemingway found his calling in life as a reporter and writer. His first known article in the Trapeze was published in 1916 and was about the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. After that, Ernest decided to mainly concern himself with writing humorous articles in the style of Ring Lardner, earning him the nickname of Ring Lardner Jr., which he sometimes signed his articles with as tribute. The clever wit of the young reporter, which would become one of the writer's signature traits, was known widely throughout the school, so much so that underneath his senior picture in the school yearbook it reads, "None are to be found more clever than Ernie." Hemingway graduated just 2 months after World War I exploded into its full frame during the spring of 1917. Despite his parents pushing him to apply to Oberlin College, the 18-year-old Hemingway was restless and overly adventurous. He couldn't see himself adapting to the collegiate life and found his interest in the World War growing from day to day. Following this interest, he tried for a spot in the Army, but was denied due to his poor eyesight. Rejected, Ernest set out to find the next best thing, something that would keep him informed about life at war. With jobs non-existent in Chicago at the time, and he in desperate need of a job, Hemingway got in touch with an uncle who directed him to the office of the Kansas City Star newspaper. Reluctantly leaving his hometown, Ernest walked into the office of the Star's head reporter, inquiring about a possible job opportunity. And even though he was inexperienced as a writer, they awarded him the job as cub reporter for the Kansas City Star, where he worked from October 17, 1917 to April 30th of 1918, reporting on news from the war. For those 6.5 months, Hemingway would begin to shape his style into something wonderful and unique. The budding writer would hone his skills and learn useful tips which he would later employ in his famous novel. His time spent working at the Star was one of the main sources which educated the naive Hemingway to the ways of war. He found himself obsessed, reading article after article talking about how to dig trenches and throw bombs, and read consistently about what was happening on the Italian front line. Stories upon stories began to fuel the young man's curiosity and inability to sit still for very long. It built up over the months until he could no longer handle such a stationary life. Hemingway knew he needed to be there, up close and in person, right smack dab in the middle of the chaos and action of war. Just after he left the Kansas City Star, Hemingway heard about a Red Cross recruitment. This was his chance to get himself involved in the action, and so he made his way into the war as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross in Italy. In May, he left New York and arrived in Paris as it was under bombardment from the Germans, and from there he eventually made his way to the Italian front line. He was introduced to the ways of war in the most horrific of ways, his first assignment being to carry mutilated bodies to a makeshift morgue after a mortar exploded nearby. Indeed, his time actually spent in the war was short and unforgiving. Just a few weeks after his first assignment, Hemingway had been handing out chocolate and other supplies to troops along the Piave River when an Austrian mortar went off and shrapnel embedded into his leg, leaving him seriously wounded and in need of medical assistance. He was rushed to the nearby hospital where he immediately went into surgery with doctors who barely spoke a word of English, thus leaving him completely blind as to whether or not he would lose his leg. It was with much luck that allowed him to keep it, and after the surgery he was whisked off to a hospital in Milan where he would be confined for 6 months. During those 6 months, Hemingway met lifelong friends along with Agnes von Kurowski, the first woman to ever really steal Hemingway's heart away. She was 26 at the time, significantly older, but Hemingway had become utterly infatuated with her. She attended to him in Milan while he recuperated, and together they had formed a relationship which had been more serious in Hemingway's mind than in hers. That same year, she had written him a letter stating she merely liked him and refused his marriage proposal. Later on, Agnes would be the inspiration for his character Catherine in the famous novel A Farewell to Arms, and is also to blame for the string of women which Hemingway kept throughout his life, always leaving them before they could break his heart. After his wound had healed, Hemingway, not even 20 years old yet in 1919, was awarded the Italian Silver Medal for bravery and sent back home to America. Back to a life of boredom next to the explosive excitement of war, adventures in foreign lands, and a romantic affair with an older woman. With $1,000 awarded to him as insurance money, Hemingway could afford to waste a year with no job, leaving himself with nothing else to do that summer but attend a fishing trip with old friends and go camping alone. Eventually, a job became a necessity, and an opportunity came along when he was offered a job working for the Toronto Star Weekly, which he eagerly accepted. It was later found out how completely dependent on the Star Hemingway had become. It was his only source of money, food, and mobility, not to mention it was his only way to get to experience the places and events which would end up shaping some of his later novels. For 4 years, from 1920 to 1924, Hemingway worked for the Toronto Star, pushing out of him an incredible competitiveness that would cause him to dig a little deeper for each story and taught him to get the inside scoop in whatever way possible. In the Hemingway Papers, a collection of personal letters and newspaper articles written by Hemingway, there is one particular letter in which Hemingway writes to his mother, telling her about how he had found out what a competing paper was about to publish and claims he went ahead and published the editorial himself. During September of 1920, Hemingway left Toronto to make his way back to his hometown in Chicago. Miraculously, he was able to keep his job at the Star, filling in articles, all the while landing a second job at the advertising magazine The Commonwealth Cooperative. During his stay, Hemingway met the woman who was to be his first wife. Hadley Richardson was in Chicago visiting the sister of Hemingway's bachelor roommate at the time. The two were instantly infatuated with each other upon first sight. However, it is said that Hemingway was taken with her because she so closely resembled Agnes von Kurowski, except with a bit more childishness about her that Agnes seemed to have lacked. Hemingway vowed he would marry her from the moment he saw her, and on September 3, 1921, the two became man and wife. It was only 2 months after their wedding that Hemingway was offered the job as foreign correspondent by the Toronto Star. The couple made their way over to Paris, where the young writer was about to find that the world of writing was changing in the likes of Gertrude Stein, Ford Madox Ford, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ezra Pound, only a few names of the group making up the famed Lost Generation. A list of names which, unbeknownst to the writer at the time, Hemingway's name would also be tacked onto. The first 2 years of Hemingway's reporting from Paris, he covered huge stories such as the Geneva Conference in April of 1922, the Greco-Turkish War in October, the Lausanne Conference in November, and the post-war convention in the Ruhr Valley in early 1923. Along with such hard-hitting political pieces, Hemingway also covered stories that involved some of his personal favorite pastimes, like bullfighting, skiing, bobsledding, and bright social life of the Parisian citizens. Hemingway's reign at the Toronto Star came to an end when he was 24 years old, when he decided to walk out on the paper for good. Reporters back then were tough, and many disliked cocky, narcissistic writers such as Hemingway. Following suit with other magazines, the owner of the Star tried to bring Hemingway's ego down a few pegs, but all that resulted in the attempt was the writer's resignation on his table. Hemingway continued to write in Paris with wife Hadley, beginning to make a name for himself as both a reporter and fledgling story writer. But when Hadley turned up pregnant, the couple made their way back to Toronto, feeling it was only right that the baby be born in North America. Soon following his return to Toronto, Hemingway found himself a job working for the Toronto Daily Star, all the while waiting for the birth of his baby. After Jack Hadley Nicanor Hemingway, whom Ernest nicknamed Bumby, was born in October of 1923, the new family wasted no time in making their way back over to Paris, and by 1924, with a letter of recommendation from Ezra Pound reading, "He's an experienced journalist. He writes very good verse and he's the finest prose stylist in the world," Hemingway was given a new journalistic job editing the literary magazine owned by Ford Madox Ford, the Transatlantic Review. And though the magazine lasted only a year and a half, it was considered a highly respectable paper, and is the first that published some of Hemingway's short stories, thus allowing him to begin making a name for himself, both as a respectable journalist and storyteller. It is within the next few years, from 1925 to 1929, that Hemingway wrote some of the most famous novels in 20th century literature. Among these are In Our Time, a collection of short stories, and The Torrents of Spring, The Sun Also Rises, and A Farewell to Arms. Over this period of time, Hemingway blossomed as a writer, receiving an enormous amount of praise as well as criticism, which Hemingway dealt with in typical Hemingway fashion.
We have a criticism today in the Morning Mail by a character who calls himself Walter H. McKay, and who writes the following, which I will condense. Your book lies upon my table. I have finished reading it, and I eye it dubiously. You got a nice eye, boy. The pages are cut rather unevenly. Nice work. You're in there. The stiff covers and the binding are normal, I think. Who are you, kid? The signature on the cover is stamped in gold, or what looks like gold. There is nothing printed on the backside of the jacket. Your own backside, boy, turn it. The blurb says the story is tender and moving. Is this the technique of the great lie? I already know there is no meaning on the printed page of the book, and now I am quite certain it is not in the binding, end papers, or jacket. No, nothing. I accordingly feel that you can remain confident in the security of your fame. No critic can budge your impregnable position now. Very truly yours, Walter H. McKay. Am returning the letter to the aforesaid McKay with the following notation. Right wipe. W-I-P-E. Your Royal Irish ass on it, Walter. You're stupid. Signed, E.H.
However he thrived as a novelist, Hemingway's personal life began to crumble with his divorce of Hadley in 1927 after she became wise to the affair he was having with a close friend, Pauline Pfeiffer. Soon after the divorce, Hemingway moved on to marry Pauline Pfeiffer, a fashion reporter for Vogue and Vanity Fair. It was with Pauline that Hemingway decided to finally leave Paris and make his way over to Key West, Florida, a suggestion by his lifelong friend, John Dos Passos. A new place for a new life. Shortly after their arrival to the small island, Pauline gave birth to two baby boys, making Hemingway a proud father. Hemingway fell in love with the charms of the island, especially with the big game fishing, and decided to rent an apartment for several years before finally purchasing a permanent residence. However, Hemingway's life was not free of tragedy. In between the birth of his sons, Hemingway received word that his father had committed suicide, a fatal shot to the head after a string of physical ailments, a terrible foreshadowing of things to come. Thanks to a $25,000 loan from Pauline's uncle, the couple and a Key West friend were whisked away to Africa, where Hemingway would make his childhood fantasies of going up against some of the most dangerous animals in the world come true. Able to exercise his skills as a hunter, they chased game throughout Kenya and Tanzania, making a lion the biggest among his trophies. Hemingway spent 3 months on the Dark Continent, a time well spent as he gathered inspiration to later add in his novels The Green Hills of Africa, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and The Short and Happy Life of Francis Macomber. Just a year after the Spanish Civil War began, Hemingway left for Spain in 1936 to cover the events of the war for the American Newspaper Alliance. During that time, Hemingway traveled with a reporter by the name of Martha Gellhorn, who embodied all of the traits of his past two wives combined, and would later become named Hemingway's third wife. The time he spent in Spain eventually led to the documentary The Spanish Earth, which Hemingway was asked by the Dutch filmmaker Joris Ivens to replace John Dos Passos as screenwriter and narrator. Hemingway's involvement in such a project spread numerous rumors about his supporting the leftist Spanish Republican causes, earning him much fame. And indeed, the hour-long film was meant as propaganda detailing the struggle of the Spanish against right-wing forces, including Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. This was also a time of much inspiration for the now seasoned writer. Hemingway spent much time in Madrid writing his first and only play, The Fifth Column, as the city was under bombardment. Being a sports enthusiast, Hemingway was particularly interested in watching bullfights and learning about the sport, much of which went into his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, published in 1940. In 1940, Hemingway now had yet another life with his brand new wife, Martha Gellhorn, calling for yet another change of scenery. Together they crossed over to Cuba on their boat and settled in Havana at a house they named Finca Vigía, or Lookout Farm, which is where they would reside over the next 20 years. Though a famed novelist by this point in his life, the reporting side of Hemingway never fled, and he continued to report on World War II from his station in his Cuban home. In 1941, both Hemingway and Martha traveled to China to report on the Second Sino-Japanese War for PM magazine. In 1944, Hemingway made his way over to Europe once again as a reporter on the Second World War. London would be his first stop, reporting on how the war was affecting the city, and it is the location where Hemingway remarkably met his fourth wife, Mary Welsh, a Time magazine editor. Together, the two traveled Europe, detailing the war in every country, reporting on events which took place at Normandy, and even witnessing the liberation of the French capital. In 1945, Hemingway divorced Martha and moved on to Mary Welsh, who moved in with him at Finca Vigía in Havana, Cuba. Hemingway, now 46 years old, had decided he had seen enough of war. Scarred and toughened by the horrific events which he had witnessed throughout his life, he decided to settle down with Mary and begin his work on The Old Man and the Sea, the self-published novel and eventual Pulitzer Prize winner. The years following the literary triumph that was his novel, Hemingway began to see what was once a ripe, youthful life grow old and crumble before him. One by one, he watched his literary friends die, along with a number of serious accidents suffered both by he and his children. It was no secret that Hemingway drank like a fish, and as a result, it was coming back to bite him in the form of serious health problems involving high blood pressure, weight gain, and diabetes. From 1948 to 1959, Hemingway traveled to Venice, had a platonic love affair with a 19-year-old girl, and made his way back to Africa where he was almost killed, all the while writing novel after novel, story after story. During the summer of 1959, he traveled back to Spain to research bullfighting articles commissioned by Life magazine. Sadly, it was the first time in his life that Hemingway had to ask for help with a manuscript that grew wildly out of control. His close friend, A.E. Hotchner, helped him cut his manuscript down to 40,000 words and spoke of Hemingway during that time to be unusually hesitant, disorganized, and confused, which was strange for the normally blunt, straightforward, albeit often inebriated, level headed man. Eventually, Hemingway had to leave Cuba due to the Cuban Revolution. Hemingway relocated himself to his final place of residency in Ketchum, Idaho, with Mary in 1960. Those times were long and hard, with Hemingway returning to Spain for a photo shoot and reporting to Mary that he was on the verge of a breakdown. He was growing old and weary, depressed. Hemingway was beginning to worry extensively about taxes and money, and paranoia began to overtake him. He was constantly thinking and complaining that the FBI was watching his every move. He was diagnosed with hypertension, and Mary sent him off to the Mayo Clinic, where it is confirmed that Hemingway was treated with electroshock therapy about 15 times. But nothing seemed to help, and Hemingway was reportedly released in ruins from the clinic. Hemingway began to experience the same exact situations and feelings that his father had, and on July 2nd, 1961, he completed the same cycle as Clarence Edmonds Hemingway by shooting himself in the face with his favorite shotgun. Sadly, it wouldn't be until 5 years after the famous reporter and writer's funeral that his family members would learn from Mary that he committed suicide. Though he died before his time, Ernest Miller Hemingway lived quite an amazing life, never once wasting a moment of it. He ventured out into the world and experienced all there was for him to see, leaving his mark behind in a variety of countries: France, Africa, Key West, Cuba, Spain, and North America. He conversed and drank with the best writers and journalists of his time, reported on some of the most groundbreaking material in World War I, the Spanish Civil War, and World War II, lived through many life-threatening situations, had romantic flings with all of the best women, and wrote the truest fiction the century has come to know.